the American economy has some major weaknesses, and you're right that it's possible that America faces a great financial crisis this year. So let's go over some of the major problem areas of the American economy. The first is artificial intelligence, where right now most American GDP is driven by investment in AI. So just building data centers, which consume a lot of water and electricity in local communities. And what's a problem is that these data centers cost tens of billions of dollars. And it's really unclear how these data centers will make money, because right now, how most people use AI is to generate videos and to like cheat in school, right? To get ChatGPT to write their essays. It's unclear how this will be beneficial to the economy. And if it's possible for AI to be profitable, this will cause millions of jobs to be lost. So it seems as though the AI bubble is about to burst. The problem, though, is that right now the U.S. economy doesn't make any sense, right? So there's Michael Berry, who is very famous for predicting that in 2008, the subprime market, the CDO market, would collapse. And he took out billions of dollars in bets against this market. And he made a lot of money. And then he made a bet against AI because he was certain that none of the fundamentals made any sense in the AI industry. And then he suddenly announced that he was actually leaving the industry. And the reason why is, okay, the AI industry doesn't make any sense. But guess what? The entire American financial industry doesn't make any more sense anymore. Meaning that right now, the American financial industry, it's controlled by a few oligarchs. It's controlled by a minority of people who can dictate the market to their will. And so the average investor, market fundamentals no longer apply to what's happening. So yes, in theory, the AR market could collapse, but because there's so few players within the AI market, it's controlled by 7 companies. They can do whatever they want, and the American government has something called Operation Stargate. Project Stargate. And so Trump has promised hundreds of billions of dollars to invest in the AI infrastructure. So it's possible that this bubble keeps on going on and on, okay? So this means that right now the American financial industry lacks the capacity to self-correct. And so if the market collapses, it's probably going to take the entire economy with it. And so that's a great problem facing the U.S. financial industry. That's problem number one. Problem number two is over-financialization. And this goes back to the silver example, where when China announced that it was going to limit its exports of silver, and China controls about 60% of the silver market in the world, the price of silver went crazy. And the reason why is that in China, silver is used for manufacturing needs. So silver goes into EV, batteries, all that. So China really needs silver. But in the United States, silver is used for speculation. So silver is really it's only paper silver. And a lot of these companies like JP Morgan, they're over leveraged 300 to 1. So every 1 ounce of silver that they have, they've promised 300 on paper. And so it's a great bubble that's going to burst. Like what we saw in silver was almost like a small bank run. But it's not just silver, it's almost all these commodities where these commodities aren't used for manufacturing needs, they're used for speculation. And so the American financial industry, it's this great Ponzi scheme that's about to explode at any point. And the third great weakness of the U.S. economy, of course, is cryptocurrency, where, Bitcoin, it's all just speculation. It brings actually no benefit to society. So you have all these major weaknesses in the American economy. But because, first of all, you have a few oligarchs who control all the resources. Second of all, the American government can print as much money as it wants. There's something called quantitative easing. And third of all, there's really no challenger to the US dollar. This bubble can sustain itself past 2026. But when it collapses, the entire society collapses. So you're basically looking at civil war.
So civil war in America?
Yes.
So in terms of gold and silver, you would assume that this rally will continue then? Given that it's the paper gold and paper silver has been inflated so far beyond what actually exists in terms of the hard assets.
Look, the reality is that demand exceeds supply, right? So silver goes into AI, it goes into EVs, batteries, because silver is the best metal conductor in the world, and there's no second. Copper is second, but it's far behind silver. So you need silver, and the world cannot produce enough silver. And this has been true for the past 5 years. And China and the United States are investing heavily into AI. So right now there's a major fight for for access to silver. And this goes back again to Venezuela, where Latin America and South America actually are the world's greatest producers of silver. So whoever controls Latin America and South America basically has control over the AI future.
Well, so things look a bit grim for the United States then. You have all these bubbles you referred to. Once this begins to fall apart, civil war becomes a real possibility. But how do you see this obviously affects the rivalry they have now with China? But what do you see on the Chinese side? Because what are the strategic priorities and how do you see them pursuing them? Because one would assume that China would also become a bit more assertive as it becomes more confident, but also as the pressure is building on the United States to essentially break China and will restore the 90s, if you will.
Yeah, so, the greatest strength and the greatest vulnerability of the United States is the US dollar. Right? But the greatest strength and the greatest weakness of China is its reliance on exports. China is an export-oriented economy, and in order to feed its economy, it focuses on exports. And sometimes its export strategies are counterproductive and self-defeating. So, for example, it dumps commodities onto the world market, which hurts the trade system. Okay, so China has also a lot of fundamental issues. Right now, the problem is that the United States is threatening to strangle, embargo, blockade China, right? So one thing that will flare up in 2026, it's already flaring up right now, is a rivalry between China and Japan, right? So Prime Minister Takaichi has said that she believes that Taiwan is part of Japan's strategic interests. And what does she mean by that? What she means by that is that if China were to get hold of Taiwan, Taiwan could blockade Japan from access to the Strait of Malacca and therefore oil from the Middle East, which Japan is dependent on. And so Japan believes that if China were to invade Taiwan, then Japan would have to step in. Okay, so Taiwan is key. But the opposite is true, where if Taiwan were to side with Japan, then the first island chain can embargo China, can block China from trade. So I think in 2026, you'll see a lot more heated rhetoric between China and Japan. And the reason why is both economies are dependent on Middle East oil. And whoever can control the Strait of Malacca can basically strangle each other's economy.
Well, this is the classical problem. I mean, again, I think we talked before about how it looks a bit like pre-World War I. That is that China has kind of outgrown this security architecture or economic architecture as well, which is, more or less designed to contain China. So there's not a diplomatic path to this. It does look like conflict becomes unavoidable. But if we shift a bit towards Europe, and which includes then Russia, you said that the Ukraine war has been more or less settled, stabilized. I assume you're not referring to stable front lines. I'm assuming that the future of the conflict has been, determined now, which seems correct. But on the other side, the reason I focus on the rationality of states is because you see from the Europeans now increasing rhetoric that, we can't afford a peace. If the war ends, then Russia would focus its resources on us. And so one after another, you see this different European leaders and media outlets saying, well, war may be better than peace now. So are we prepared to end this war, or how do you see this playing out now?
Yeah, so I think the future is obvious. Europe is going to militarize against Russia, even though it is against the best interests of its people. Its people will be very upset with remilitarization. You're already seeing massive protests in Germany. A lot of this will be irrational, meaning Europe has actually no path to victory in Ukraine, but Europe's going to send men to their deaths in Ukraine anyway, because Europe doesn't know what else to do, right? So what Europe is really saying is that we banked on Russia losing this war, and then we could impose an indemnity on Russia, and that would solve all our fiscal problems. Now that Russia is winning the war, we are facing economic collapse at home, and we don't really want to face that, so we're going to continue the war and hope for the best. So there's no strategy here. It's suicidal, it's irrational, but Europe is stuck where it is.
Well, whenever I ask different experts what they see the likelihood of a direct war between Russia and the Europeans, they usually say, very little, because the Europeans don't have the troops. It would be suicidal. But this assumes that all wars are calculated and deliberate, because I think an accidental war by miscalculation would be rooted in this assumption of escalation control. That is, the Europeans can't afford to see Russia win, so we'll send a little bit more extra long-range missiles missiles. We try to target the political leadership. Let's blow up some Russian tankers. So we escalate at the same time as pressure is mounting on Moscow to stop allowing the Europeans to step over all red lines. So why should the Russians accept Europeans engaging in direct attacks, killing Russians? So they will then retaliate. And I don't think the Europeans want this, but want a direct war. They would just like to kill Russians through Ukraine and then, claim that their hands are clean. But I don't think this is coming to an end. I think from what I hear coming out of Moscow, this is we're reaching the end of the line, and especially the Germans should be hit hard if they continue along this path. But if you open any European or German newspaper, they don't seem to realize this at all. If they recognize possibility of war, it's because Russia will want to restore the Soviet Union or something, march on Paris, something along those lines. Do you think, though, that this is a real prospect?
Look, I think that the leadership of Europe, the European elite, they live in their own reality. So, like YouTube and social media, there are different bubbles. And I think like the European elite, they literally believe that Russia will collapse tomorrow. And we just wait another day, then the Russian economy will collapse, the people of Russia will revolt, and Putin will be overthrown, and then Russia will sue for peace. If you just watch their media, they repeat this over and over, and it becomes a self-reinforcing bubble. The EU is just this brawling, self-reinforcing bureaucracy, and they're not capable of imagining defeat. They're not capable of imagining different possibilities. They're absolutely certain that if they just wait out one more day, then the war will be over and they would have won. And if you talk about irrationality, go back to World War I, and for those 4 or 5 years where these millions of people were dying for no reason, and the reason why was these leaders just could not accept the possibility that they had made a mistake. Okay, I mean, I understand this is all silly. Why would you sacrifice millions of men because you can't afford to make a mistake? They can't afford to admit that, hey, maybe sending Boris Johnson to sabotage peace talks between Kiev and Moscow was wrong. Maybe blowing that Nord Stream pipeline was wrong. Maybe antagonizing Russia these 20 years by expanding NATO to its borders was wrong. These people absolutely refuse to admit they're wrong, and they're willing to sacrifice their own nations to avoid admitting, being wrong.
Yeah, even now that the NATO losing Ukraine is starting to become obvious, the new goal appears to be, let's lose slower. Let's keep the Ukrainians a little bit longer in the fight, even though it will be a humanitarian disaster for Ukraine and also strategic disaster for Europe, because this is not good for them. But how do you see this playing out in the European security architecture, though? Because again, the EU and NATO are the two main pillars of how Europe has been structured in the post-Cold War era. They're supposed to, be the hegemonic order of Europe, also what US unipolarity was supposed to rest on, especially NATO. Did you see them being able to survive? 2026 might hold on, but how do you see this? What would you expect from 2026? A complete collapse isn't necessarily in the cards, but it seems to be deteriorating fast. I mean, as we speak, Trump is laying claim to Greenland, and the Danish Prime Minister trying to refer to Article 5, but I'm not sure if America would come to the defense of Greenland if America goes after Greenland. I mean, this is kind of absurd stuff.
Look, the reality is that Trump hates Europe. He's hated Europe ever since 2016, when Europe basically insulted him during his first presidency. Europe thought he was a joke, he was a charlatan, and Europe conspired with Obama to overthrow him in 2020. So Trump hates Europe. And you can tell because, what's the first thing that happened after Trump won election? He sent J.D. Vance to Europe to scold Europe for failing Western civilization, right? For letting in too many immigrants, for embracing woke ideology, for betraying Christian values. And so Trump would be more than happy to see the entire NATO system collapse. And you could argue that Trump is forcing NATO to collapse because Trump is forcing NATO to fight a war it could possibly not win against Russia. So I think what's going to happen is that NATO will sleepwalk into disaster into Ukraine. And the reason why is that it's just this lumbering bureaucracy that cannot possibly imagine its own demise. And these are just bureaucrats who just want to collect their own paycheck and who are looking for their own pension. So they don't really care what happens. They'll just do what they're told. And this war will be settled in Odessa. I think that NATO will collapse in Odessa because NATO will commit to defending Odessa. Russia will encircle it, blockade it, and NATO will not be able to hold on. NATO will force Europeans to be conscripted into the army to die in Odessa. They will refuse, and you will have civil war throughout Europe. But this is like a 5 to 10 year time frame. It's not going to happen this year. It's going to be another 5 to 10 years. But it's a slow death for Europe.
So Odessa would be the end of the Ukraine war then?
Yes.
Yeah. No, well, that makes sense. The Russians have set their eyes on Odessa as this is to a large extent about the Black Sea, and of course, this is where NATO attacks Russia primarily from Odessa. And I think the British and French would never accept giving up Odessa. This is, I think, the key prize in this war. So you're probably spot on there. How about Europe's goal of strategic autonomy? This was, we heard for many years, strategic autonomy, European sovereignty. These were the slogans of the EU. It's very stark contrast, the subservience to a US which hates Europe. But how do you see the internal cohesion holding in place? Because I think Europe, it succeeded when it was able to deliver economic benefits to its member state as a collective bargaining power. I don't see that anymore.
Yeah, so after 1945, Europe was forced to adopt the ideas of the open society, right? This is Karl Popper, who argued that World War II was caused by fascism, by this excessive embrace of nationalism. So to prevent another great war, societies have become much more open, multicultural, tolerant, and that was a strategy for the EU bureaucracy for the past few decades. That's why they've let in so many immigrants. That's why they've embraced woke ideology, and it's basically made these societies much more polarized. So you have the real possibility of civil war in Britain, in France, because they've let in all these immigrants, and the natives see these immigrants as a threat to their cultural identity. And so, wars are fought because people want to fight them to protect the ones they love, and they fight them for their homeland. But right now, if you go to Britain and you ask them, like, what does Britain mean to you? I think British people would be hard to answer you. If these immigrants in Britain, if you interview them and you say, hey, are you willing to go fight a war in Ukraine to defend Britain? And they'll say, hell no. And the natives are like, why would I leave this land to go die in Ukraine so that these immigrants can take it over after I'm dead? So the idea of, getting these Europeans to go fight anywhere is just ridiculous now. And yeah, I mean, you will conscript quite a few because these European nations have become authoritarian, but it's going to destroy their societies. So Europe is no longer capable of fighting a full-scale conflict with Russia.
Sometimes I get a feeling of some similarities with the Soviets after the Bolshevik Revolution when they were fighting, because the Russians were deeply religious. So when they were essentially going to fight under a Bolshevik or a Soviet flag, the problem then was what exactly are they fighting for? So they kind of had to allow the church to come back in, because this is what people fought for. And I get the same impression now that the Europeans are being told that we have to go and die for them to fight Russia. And if you ask why, they will refer to the nation and the typical things people would die for. But they spent the past years, if not decades, to express their contempt for our faith, our traditions, our culture, and now we're supposed to die for it. I mean, what are we dying for? It doesn't really make any sense. I mean, this is what nationalism is. People kill for it, but they're also willing to die for it. I think the smearing of nationalism, even though it was introduced in the French Revolution with democratization, I think it's been another flaw. But how does this play into the United States? Because the Europeans were a key partner of the US in the past in order to, during Cold War and the hegemonic era. But what do you see the Americans doing now? If they drifting further away from the Europeans, will they abandon bloc politics, or will they simply demand subservience? How will the US build its power moving forward? Because this is what perplexes many European politicians. Every time America slams them or threatens to take Greenland, they all go on Twitter going, well, we're good allies. You need us to be great, but it doesn't appear that this sentiment is shared by Washington. So what will the US build its power on?
Look, the United States is now transactional. It's an empire. and it's going to exploit its vassals. And if it cannot exploit its vassals, it will just abandon them. So the United States right now, it's uncertain what it can derive from Europe, right? Europe has an aging population. It is not willing to fight wars. It does not have that many able-bodied men. It has very few resources. So the United States doesn't really know what it can do with Europe. And in fact, the United States believe that Europe has been stealing and exploiting the United States for the past few decades. It's the American security infrastructure that has protected Europe, that has allowed Europe to create its welfare state, that has allowed Europe to... basically, the Americans think that the Europeans are just lazy and decadent and corrupt. And so the United States is preparing to throw Europe like overboard, right? Just abandon Europe to Russia and forget about it. And so so the United States national security strategy, it's very clear. It's going to use the Western Hemisphere to project its power overseas. So the example goes back to China, where, listen, in the future, China, if you want resources, don't think about the Middle East because it's on fire, right? The entire place is at war. Don't think about Europe because Europe is dead. Don't think about Africa because we're going to challenge you there as well. You're going to have to come and buy resources from the Western Hemisphere, and therefore you're going to have to buy from us. So I think that's the national security strategy going forward. The United States is intent on maintaining its hegemony for the US dollar, and so it needs to make China subordinate to the US dollar, dependent on the US dollar.
Yeah, this idea that they will, in this new imperial phase of the United States, that they will either exploit or abandon. I don't think the Europeans appreciate this, because I heard the same from Americans as well. Like we were trying to decide whether or not we should make it an exclusive sphere of influence for the United States or just extract the wealth. But if it's the option between being exploiting or abandoning, the Europeans can't envision a future without the leadership of the US. So they're allowing, I think, the US to extract wealth at the moment through all this, putting companies across the Atlantic or these trade deals, which are so horrible, but they still sign them on Trump's golf course. But of course, this is a temporary fix. Once America extracted everything it needs, Europe is even weaker, more irrelevant, and it will be abandoned anyways. But well, again, there's no discussion in the political class what to do. It's just the assumption of this: a Trump is a bad man, and if we just wait him out, things will go back to normal.
That's literally what they're doing. They believe that in 2028, the Democrats will come in, reverse all of Trump's policies, as Biden did in 2020. And what the Europeans don't realize is that this is a new reality. We're not going back to 2020. Even if the Democrats were to come in 2028, they're going to maintain Trump's imperial policies because this is the best interest of America. America derives no benefit from helping Europe in any way.
Oh, especially if it grows even more irrelevant. I mean, but they don't see it in terms of national interest and the value of an alliance. They talk about friendship and values, which is kind of it's
yeah.
But so again, where the ideology comes in, I mean, this is they convince themselves that this is what glues us together, as opposed to having common strategic interest. But for the United States, though, do you see overall its power retrenching? Will they overextend, or will there just be a complete absence of a coherent strategy?
So what we're seeing is acceleration of the demise of the American empire. So let's go back to Venezuela. And I'm sure, everyone saw what happened where, these Chinook helicopters carrying Delta Force special operators flew into Caracas and killed basically Maduro's Cuban security team, and then escorted him to New York, where he was perp walked. And it seemed as though, a triumph of the Romans, right? Where they brought in these kings who they captured and they paraded him through the streets of Rome. And so in America, everyone's ecstatic about this. Everyone thinks this is tremendous. But what people don't recognize is that, the reason why Americans didn't do this in the past is because it's stupid to do this sort of stuff, right? Because why would you insult a nation like this? So not only did the Americans go kidnap a sovereign head of state who represent the state itself, they also destroyed the mausoleum of Hugo Chavez, who is the spiritual hero of the Chavismo movement in Venezuela, who is the current regime in Venezuela. So Trump has made it impossible now for the United States to seek an arrangement for Venezuela. Even if there's some negotiation that takes place, it's going to end up in bad faith because Venezuelans have lost trust in the United States. But not only that, but South America right now will rally against the United States. Trump has threatened both Mexico and Colombia. He has his eyes set on Cuba, on Nicaragua. So now the South Americans are like, we can't trust the Americans. We need to stick together, and they're going to resist American power. And then Africa, Europe, the entire world is going to see America for the bully that it is. this. So listen, America had the greatest military for the past 50, 60 years. It didn't really want to use its military because once you start using your military, you're stuck using the military forever, right? You're better off using soft power through, you're better off using covert ops, propaganda, infiltration. And that's what America did really well for these 50, 60 years. And they could have done the same thing in Venezuela where, they could have just basically bribed Maduro, bribed the elite to seek an economic treaty with the United States where all oil belonged to the United States. And Venezuela would have agreed to this, and all of South America would have been happy with this deal, but instead it chose to do what it did because it wanted to project strength and power. And so it sacrificed strategy for optics. And this is a sign of an empire in decline where it's no longer capable of grand strategy, where it's no longer capable of foresight, it's no longer capable of restraint and humility. It's complete hubris. We see this all the time when empires are in decline, where not only does it antagonize its enemies, but also antagonize its own allies and exploits its vassals. So what the United States is doing, it's suicidal, it's short term, it's stupid. And look, in the short term, I say for the next 2 to 3 years, it will look great in that, America is able to control the entire Western Hemisphere, all the world bows to America. In the long term, you have sowed the seeds for global discontent, for a global revolution against American power. And basically, I think that the American empire is done with.